Hello, everybody. This is Tad Radzinski. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, How to Measure, Report, and Reduce Your Scope 3 Emissions. We're excited to provide this presentation and education today, so thank you all for joining. Before I get started, I want to run through a few housekeeping notes. You can definitely ask questions, and we encourage that throughout the webinar. You can basically type your questions in the question pane, and we will definitely answer some of the questions at the end. And for those we don't answer, we can respond to those questions after the webinar. We will be definitely looking for your engagement throughout this webinar. We're going to be asking some questions of attendees. We'll also be doing a few polls. So we'll be looking for your interaction as much as possible because we want this to be as interactive as possible. And we definitely will be, just so everybody knows, you will be muted during this entire webinar. So any questions you have, definitely type them into the question pane and we will definitely answer them, like I said. We will be administering a few polls and we will launch the polls throughout the webinar. Once you're done answering the poll, just click submit. And then when all the answers are submitted, we will definitely review the results with the group. And this webinar is being recorded. So we will be distributing this to everybody that has registered for this within 24 hours. So with that, I'm going to get rolling right in here. Again, I'm Tad Radzinski. I'm the president of Sustainable Solutions Corporation. Very excited to have you all on this invite-only webinar. This is not one that we sent out to the whole world. We basically kept this very limited to folks that have attended our LCA webinar series in the past, and we're very excited to have you all. I do want to thank you all for taking the time to spend with us on this webinar today. I do want to run through the agenda really quickly. First, we're going to start out with an overview of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We're then going to talk about market drivers, which we're really moving the needle here with Scope 3. We're going to be talking about strategies for measuring and reporting your Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is something that very complicated right now. There's a lot going on with it, and we want to kind of dive in on some of the key things that we know are working. We'll also talk about Scope 3 baselining and hotspots, how to do that process for identifying your company's top Scope 3 categories. We'll talk about the importance of suppliers in measuring and reducing Scope 3 emissions. Reduction is really a big focus for most of the companies that are setting goals or doing their measurements, so really important that we dive deep on that. And then we're going to talk about how to do continuous data improvement and best methods of reporting and communicating this information as you go forward. I do want to say that the Scope 3 process is a journey. There's a lot to it. It's a lot of information. There's a lot of data to collect. There's a lot to look at, and there's a lot of people to collaborate with. And we're going to talk about that as we go through the webinar today. So I do want to set the stage here with an overview of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We have people from all levels of companies here that are in different levels of maturity in their sustainability journey or different activities that they're doing. So I always like to make sure that we just set the stage on identifying what are the emissions that are out there. We're talking mainly about greenhouse gas emissions, and the most predominant one that we're all familiar with is CO2, but there's many other greenhouse gases that have to be accounted for, like methane and nitrogen oxides and refrigerants like HFCs and different things like that. So we definitely are moving forward here. Many companies are actually analyzing these emissions or trying to understand what is their baseline, where are they. I don't ever want to assume that everybody's done this because there's many companies out there that haven't even done their GHG emissions for Scope 1 and 2 yet. And when we talk about these emissions, the easiest way to think about it is if you look at this, Scope 1 or direct emissions are the emissions that come from things you typically burn or from, and that would be fuels and different things you use in your operations or in your vehicles. It also comes from refrigerants or industrial gases that you might have in your operations. Scope 2 would be indirect emissions, and that's definitely from the things you buy, like electricity. Maybe you're buying chilled water, maybe you're buying steam. So it's those those energy sources that you're buying and utilizing. And then scope 3 is everything else. And if you think about it, many of us, in our own homes and everything we do, many of us may be using fuels to heat our homes or heat our hot water, or, for hot water for clothes, etc. We're using electricity for everyday operations and, just basically to run our lives. And then the indirect emissions are everything else outside of that. So this would be like the purchased goods and services from your suppliers. It would be things like the transportation services. It would be employee commuting and things like that. And these are definitely something that we don't have control of. They're beyond our control. So scope 1 is definitely the things typically we burn. Scope 2 is typically what we buy in terms of energy sources. And scope 3 is those emissions that are beyond our control typically. Many of you who have joined this should have received an email from Juliana that sent a thought prompt. It's our scope 3 categories explained document. This comes right out of our scope 3 training academy that we put together. And this thought prompt is definitely a good overview of the various categories. There's actually 15 categories that we have to deal with, everything from purchased goods and services through use of energy use in of the products that you make, employee commuting, business travel, leased assets, all kinds of different things. And if you've ever read the greenhouse gas protocols, these are pretty complicated. So we put together this document to make it easy to read and understand on what some of these are, and basically plain English on this. So that thought prompt you should have in your email, but if you didn't get it, you can scan this QR code here and you can get it right away. We do know that many of the greenhouse gas emissions inventories that are being done for both scope 1, 2, and 3 are following. Definitely the greenhouse gas protocol is a major guide for this, but there's a lot of other international standards that are being utilized when we're looking at greenhouse gases. ISO 14064, -1, -2, -3. ISO 14067 is a major international standard that we have to follow if we're going to be doing product carbon footprints and reporting that information, and then other various standards out there. So we're going to be talking a lot today about the greenhouse gas protocols as we go through this. I just wanted to make sure everybody's clear on what is the guiding document for actually doing these calculations. I don't ever want to assume that most companies or organizations have done their own scope 1 and 2 calculations or greenhouse gas inventories, but this is just an example of what these typically look at. This is a very simple example. Since these are pretty small emissions, this is probably coming from an office building or some service provider's activities. And you can see here that we're tracking scope 1, which is definitely the blue in these graphics, and then scope 2 is the orange. And this basically gives us the understanding of what is our responsibility in terms of our scope 1 and 2 that we can control. Okay, so these are things that we can typically control in our operations or in our manufacturing plants. And it's really important to note that if you do have a lot of suppliers or service providers, as well as many other the categories that we're going to talk about in scope 3, typically their scope 1 and 2 emissions are going to be part of your scope 3. So it's definitely important to note that. And there's a lot of guidance on the greenhouse gas protocols on how to calculate this and document it. And I will say that we do know when we're looking at different suppliers that many of the suppliers are at different levels of maturity in their sustainability journey. Some have not even done any kind of scope 1 or scope 2 greenhouse gas inventory, or don't have those calculations. They're not even available. And it is something that is really important. We're going to talk more about that as we go through here. So the thing that we really like to talk about, though, is why should you be calculating emissions? And I'm going to talk about market drivers in a second. And market drivers are definitely a major opportunity and a reason to do this. There's many customers that are requiring this. There's different regulations that have come out. Science-based targets are driving this. But it's important to be prepared, and getting a baseline and developing your targets is important to start now. I also know that by doing this, it helps you to really understand your risks and identify opportunities on what you can do to reduce. And as we go into this, we're going to talk about the fact that many of the scope 3 categories if you're looking at reducing, some of them you have more control over than others, things like maybe your employee commuting or things like your business travel, maybe some of the leased assets and things like that. However, when it gets into the fact that you're really concerned about getting information and connecting with many of others that are outside of your control, it makes it really complicated. So I'll go over these market drivers pretty quickly. These are new regulations that are driving measurement and disclosure requirements. The Securities and Exchange Commission just put out a new regulation. Originally, this was going to require measurement and disclosure by publicly traded companies of scope 1 and 2 and 3. However, the rule came out and basically it's requiring scope 1 and 2 at this time. However, I will tell you that we have a number of companies we're working with that are suppliers or customers. You know, they're selling materials to companies that are saying, hey, we're publicly traded and we believe that we're going to have to report scope 3 someday. So we're going to start asking you to start tracking your information and reporting to us your scope 1 and 2 and your scope 3. Same thing in California. Senate Bill 253, Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, is requiring the reporting of scope 1 and 2 in 2026 based on 2025 data for scope 1 and 2, and then scope 3 is going to have to be reported in 2027 based on 26 data. So it's giving some time to do that. And then there's also like financial related, climate related financial risk disclosures that are required and different things like that that are coming up. And many of these legislations have been rolled out, but there's a lot of litigation going on right now. However, we're seeing a huge uptick in companies that are trying to figure out how they're going to comply with these in the future. Same thing with the federal government. They have federal acquisition regulations, and there's a FAR out there right now that is requiring disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risks. And I know there's multiple companies on this webinar right now that are direct suppliers to the federal government. And if you are a tier 3 supplier or major supplier that has basically, you know, has annual federal funding exceeding $50 million or whatever, you're basically looking at having to report your greenhouse gas inventory, scope 1, 2, and 3 annual disclosure, and setting science-based targets. So many drivers going on right now. We're seeing huge movement around embodied carbon legislation. Embodied carbon means that there's different states that are requiring product manufacturers to start to understand the carbon footprint of their products and disclose that. We've already talked about the California bill. We do know that this is an international thing as well. You can see in Canada, there's some international regulations. There's all kinds of things that are going on in terms of driving this movement. We cannot forget about Europe. Europe, not only do we have the European Green Deal that's been ongoing for a while now that's looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but then we have the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSDDD. There's all these regulations. I talk to a lot of different sustainability leaders on a regular basis, and they are routinely telling me that this is things that keep them up at night. Not only do they have to start, you know, really getting to understand all their emissions, but there's all these new regulations that they're coming out that they have to comply with. It's adding a level of complexity. So bottom line here with this is that these things are not going to go away. Basically, once things get into legislation, you're going to see this start to grow. So this not only grows for many of the people that are on this webinar right now, but all of your suppliers and everybody else it's going to affect. So we're going to have our first poll now. We're going to talk about science-based targets. And Juliana, if you want to launch that poll, that'd be great. Please try to answer the poll. Has your company already set science-based targets, or is your company planning to set them? Yes or no? If you could just answer that in the poll, that would be great. And we'll see what's going on there in terms of activity. So we're getting a lot of response, about 75% so far saying yes, 24% no. Numbers keep coming in. We're going to give it another couple minutes here. We got 60% voted. We typically try to get around 70% of people voting. So if you can keep voting here. Has your company already set science-based targets, or is your company planning to set them? All right. All right, we're getting there. 75%, 25%. So if I continue on here, it looks like about 3/4, Juliana, you can close that poll. About 3/4 of the folks that have voted are having set science-based targets, and about 25% of you have not. Okay, so that's great information. So many of you already know what science-based targets are, but for those that haven't set them, I just want to be clear that science-based targets are basically managed by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's a global body that's basically enabling businesses to set ambitious goals for emissions targets. And basically what this does is have companies set what are called near-term targets, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute, and long-term targets. And basically this is done in alignment with the Paris Accord to limit global warming to basically 1.5 degrees C, no more than that. And this is a process where you basically are setting these targets, and then you're submitting them to the SBTI for review and approval. And then you're going to do reporting on a regular basis. And the fact that there's near-term and short-term goal targets is something that is really important in terms of how you set the targets and how you move forward. As you can see here, based on this data, this is fresh from today. There's about 8,000, little over almost 8,200 companies that are taking action in terms of setting science-based targets. And one thing that we're seeing here, this is many companies had originally started out doing this voluntarily. However, what we're seeing here, this is a letter that came out from some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world through their Sustainable Markets Initiative. And this letter went out to many of the suppliers that basically provide, services and products and materials and packaging and all kinds of things to the pharmaceutical companies. And if we blow this up to see what their targets are, these joint minimum supplier targets are as follows. So these big pharmaceutical companies, and this is just one example of a sector that's doing something. I want to show this. And we have a lot of companies that we're working with that got this letter, and they got this, and they reached out to us, and they were like, can you tell us what a science-based target is? And can you tell us what scope 1, 2, and 3 is? And how do we do this? As you can see here, this letter is basically asking suppliers to assess and disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2025. They're also asking for commitments from these companies by 2025 to commit to setting near-term targets aligned with the 1.5 degree pathway for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There's multiple other ones in here in terms of looking at, how to reduce waste, especially solvents. It's looking at sourcing green heat by 2030. That would mean looking at more renewable ways to, heat things, or instead of combusting natural gas or other fuels. Also committing to setting standards with your own suppliers, and then some targets around water efficiency and water stewardship practices. So you can see this letter goes well beyond just doing an inventory, but asking these suppliers to basically move forward and set their own science-based targets. So if I look at one of those examples of the companies that actually sent that letter or signed on to it, and this letter was signed by the CEOs, you can see here that the near-term targets for AstraZeneca, and this is publicly available information, you can get this right off of websites, or AstraZeneca might have advertised this or right off the SBTI website. And you can see here that their biggest commitment here is to reduce absolute scope 3 GHG emissions 50% by 2030 from a 2019 baseline. And they're doing this, they're looking at many of their categories. I'm not going to read all the print in here, but they're looking at many of their categories. But the one that is most interesting here is AstraZeneca is committing that 95% of its suppliers by spend covering purchased goods and services, as well as capital goods and transportation, et cetera, will have science-based targets by 2025. So this is a big deal. And this is something that if you're a smaller company and you have not even done your GHG inventories, and you get this letter and you're suddenly trying to understand what has to happen here, it's actually pretty scary. So we have been communicating with and helping multiple companies to try to understand how they're going to meet these requirements for going forward. So when I talk to companies, I'm trying to let them know, if you're like, this would be one of the pharmaceutical companies, let's just say in that example, original equipment manufacturer, they've got pressure from investors and customers and regulations to start measuring their own scope 1, 2, and 3. And then they're looking at getting, moving forward here. And then they have to reach out to all those suppliers we just talked about, but every one of those suppliers has suppliers. So imagine if you're a company that has some of these big companies have 70,000 suppliers, and you're getting that letter. So that's 70,000 of these lines, and then you got all those suppliers have suppliers. So this thing just really grows and grows. It's a big deal. So in terms of strategies for measuring and reporting scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, one thing that we're definitely looking at here is we are recommending that you're working as a team. You're basically pulling together a whole group within your companies, and you're starting to dive in. And usually this is going to start with somebody leading the show, and then someone working very closely, ideally with procurement. They're a great source for information. And this diagram or this slide that I show you here is basically giving you guidance on who you're going to want to work with. And for some of you, I know many of you are already working on this. You're diving in with your procurement teams. You're doing different things. And the procurement teams are definitely going to be really valuable in giving you information about your own scope 1 and 2 in terms of electricity and fuels. They're going to be really useful for providing information about what suppliers and service providers you're using, what type of spend data, because that is all the basis for starting to do these scope 3 calculations as you're going forward. And then as you continue that journey, you're most likely going to be working with many others within your operations and whatnot. So we definitely encourage most companies that we're working with to get a team together and start working on this. A lot of times this falls initially on the sustainability team, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to go about doing this. But you're really, if you're going to be doing anything with scope 3 or even your scope 1 and 2, all these other folks on here are going to be really important to work with in order to get the data you need, because there is quite an effort into basically pulling that data together. And one thing that we definitely look for as we roll into this is we are really focused on working in collaboration, not only with your internal teams, but with your external stakeholders like your suppliers and, you know, service providers and different things like that. And what you have to look at here is, all right, if I have not done this already, I know many of you on this call have already started working with your procurement teams and you're communicating with them. But oftentimes, you know, the procurement team's job is to basically work on, you know, managing suppliers and doing all their procurement activities and sourcing activities or their category manager activities. And they're not really usually well versed in what's going on in terms of how scope 3 could affect them or what's involved with it. So we basically have, you know, we definitely are working with many companies that are looking at what is the level of knowledge of our supplier, our procurement team that are working with our suppliers, and what's that level of background that they have. And the action plan we typically put together with this would be assembling the team, you know, getting that team together, communicating and collaborating together and informing them on what this is, just like I talked about the market drivers, why this is important to your customers, things like that. And then we're finding that it's really imperative to do training and education for your procurement teams. We have several companies we're working with that are like, the procurement teams have kind of gotten this responsibility and they're trying to figure out how they're going to go about it. And they're running in different directions and things like that. So the training, the education is really important. And these are just some topics that you want to make sure that your procurement teams are aware of. What is sustainability? What are sustainable supply chain management activities? What is my role in procurement and helping with these, you know, reducing scope 3 or understanding it? About teach them how to engage with suppliers to meet the scope 3 goals. And then again, you're going to work with that procurement team to really understand the supplier universe, spend data. We're going to talk about the different methods of doing calculations and how important it is to start somewhere to get these estimates, but then to dive in deep to try to get more primary data as you go forward. They'll have information on supplier details, and then they're going to be essential in developing a supplier engagement strategy. So one thing that we definitely know is that you're going to work with those suppliers, you're going to have them engaged, you're going to work with your procurement teams in a big way and basically get them involved. And the thing that we have to think about here is, well, when we dive into scope 3, first thing you have to do is try to understand what are those categories that are most critical to us. So now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that and dive in here on what is the scope 3 baseline and hotspot process. And before I do that, we're going to launch another poll. And here I want to ask, have you completed a baseline / hotspot analysis to identify which scope 3 categories are most relevant to your company? And if you say yes to this, please type in the chat, what is your top category? You can put that right in the chat questions pane, actually. What is your top category for this? So looks like the poll is launched. We got people jumping in. Have you completed a baseline hotspot analysis to identify which scope 3 categories are most relevant to your company? If yes, which category is your top category? You put that right in the questions pane. I'm seeing a lot of people put in things like category 1, purchase goods and services rolling in. That's typically what we see, lots of that activity. So this is great. A lot of good information here. So purchase goods and services mean you got a major connection with your suppliers. Use of product is a big one. That's great. I'm seeing people talking about materials, so that would fall under purchase goods and services. There's another one on use of product. So excellent. This is great. All right, we got about a good number of people voted, so we can close that poll. Thank you all for doing that. This has given me some good information. So when I talk to you all, so when we're doing scope 3 accounting, I'm gonna refer back to this slide a couple times here. But the accounting methodology, basically you have a need for doing high level calculations here. So typically what you're going to want to do is conduct your screening to prioritize what data you need to get and start to look at the different categories and determine which are likely the largest influence on your company. And I will say that every company is going to be different. The common thread that I saw here in the response to this poll we just did is definitely purchase goods and services. And that's traditionally very much seen in most companies. In fact, some companies, their purchase goods and services could be, you know, a huge part of their greenhouse gas emissions for scope 3, and we'll talk more about that here. The next thing, once you get all that data together, you've worked with your procurement team, you're getting that information together, and you're starting to do that analysis. And usually what most companies are going to do is they really start out with spend. They're going to look at, all right, we've got 50,000 suppliers, but we have like 500 of them are our top suppliers for different things. And we're looking at the fact that those suppliers are, you know, we're spending a certain amount of money with them, and you start to keep slicing and dicing that data. And then from there, you can start to think about, all right, how are we going to actually then do our calculations around scope 3? And I'm going to run through all this in more detail in a minute here. The other thing we would then do is after we do that step, then we need to figure out, all right, how are we going to engage with our value chain, the different people that are contributing to our scope 3 emissions, and how are we going to do our data aggregation reporting? So this is the high level, how are we going to do scope 3 accounting? And we'll come back to this. So I'm coming back to this list. That thought prompt that Juliana had sent out is great. But if you look here at our scope 3 categories, a lot of you put in category 1, purchase goods and services. I know we have companies right now that they've done their greenhouse gas inventories and they've done their estimates to figure out where they are in terms of scope 3. And they have determined, and some of them have determined that their scope 1 and 2, that's their fuels and their electricity use and, you know, whatever refrigerants and things like that, might only make up a few percent, 2 or 3 or 4%. And then that 95 or 96% is coming from these other categories, with a huge majority of it usually coming from purchase goods and services and things like that. So I do want to point out to you that every one of your companies is different. And as you're looking at these scope 3 categories, the first thing you want to do is get a cut to see which ones are most important to me, because all 15 probably won't apply. And when you do this analysis, there's probably going to be a top 4 or 5 that you're going to want to focus on. Some of these that you will have control on and you can do calculations on might be category 6, business travel. If you work with a travel agency or you book your travel through Concur, you can easily get your business travel information in terms of, you know, what your spend was, and maybe some of them even might report the greenhouse gases from all your air travel or possibly train travel and things like that. So there's definitely ways to measure that you can look at. But the thing to look at here is, how do we go about determining what are the hotspots? So here's an example. This is from some sector guidance that CDP has put out, and this is on the chemical sector. I'm going to use an example here where I talk about the chemical sector. So if you look at this, we can see here that for this chemical sector, there's a good percentage of their emissions are scope 1 and scope 2. But if you notice here, their purchased goods and services make up about 43.97% on average. Use of sold products, that's a really big one, especially for companies that are making things like jet planes or automobiles or things like that. Use of sold products or even electronics are going to be a big slice. End of life treatment of sold products are all big things. So this sector guidance is a good place to start to give you an idea where you might fall. But then ideally in your scope 3 analysis, you're going to want to try to get a good feel for this. And what you're going to definitely do is, like I said, start out with that spend-based approach. And you're also going to be looking at who are the big drivers of our of this influence here. We're going to look at the size of our suppliers. We're going to look at the size of those scope 3 categories. We're going to look at what influence there might be in terms of potential emission reductions that we could influence and take care of. You're going to definitely be looking at your stakeholders. What are our critical stakeholders, like our customers, asking us to do? What regulations are driving us to think about this? And different things like that. And that sector guidance that I just showed is a really helpful tool to help you look at this. So then you're going to say, all right, well, now that I've started to get this data and I'm trying to understand this is a great example for category 1, which is purchased goods and services, which I saw a lot of you talk about. I also saw, others putting in some other categories like transportation and whatnot. This is the direct information that you would see right in the greenhouse gas protocol. And I can tell you right now, this is in order of priority in terms of getting specific data. One thing that we're hearing from many of the big companies in terms of their folks from, the sustainability teams and their senior VPs of sustainability and whatnot, their chief sustainability officers, is they know they have to report this data, but they want to be reporting data that they're confident in. And a lot of times when you're doing like a spend-based method where you're starting out way down here, you're only going to be having average data. There's very limited calculations you can do in terms of economic input-output analysis and things like that. And those things are definitely important, and everybody has to start there, and that gives you your estimates. But then you're going to continue to move up this model to eventually get the holy grail, which is primary data. If we can get primary data from suppliers, that's the best. And I'm going to talk a lot about how we do that in a minute here. But you also want to be getting primary data when you're looking at your other categories, like, for example, even business travel, trying to get clear information on what was our actual travel, what maybe were the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. That's an example of how you would look at that. A lot of companies are definitely working on average data method, which is definitely a great way to do this. And that's where you would use some emissions based on secondary data like life cycle assessment databases and things like that. In our company, we always start our scope 3 baseline and hotspot analysis initially with a spend-based method. We're going to work really closely with the procurement teams and the companies we work with. And then we're going to keep moving up here. And being that our company does a lot of life cycle assessment, like many of you that got invited to this webinar joined our LCA webinar series. And that LCA data is very helpful for getting more improved quality data in terms of using average data method or the hybrid method. And this is where you're, like in these methods up here, supplier specific method, this is where you're getting specific data right from your suppliers. Right here, scope for average data method, you might be getting scope 1 and 2 data from your suppliers. That would be their greenhouse gas emissions and their operations. But then you would then be using information on scope 3 from a different source for them to make those estimates. So again, ongoing process. This is a journey. Scope 3 is a journey. It's going to definitely be something you want to take time on and learn as you go and basically continue to improve. I've talked to several people that I know that are in the sustainability world. They're, in that chief sustainability officer or director of sustainability. And many of them are saying that they expect that they're going to be retiring doing scope 3. So it does take some time to do this. But the good thing is there's more and more activity happening in it, and we're seeing more movement on it. Now, when we do look at the greenhouse gas protocols, they do require that you have you're continually improving your data quality. So if we go back to this, when you start down here, your spend-based data is just giving you a rough estimate. It's usually very inaccurate data. I know we have some companies that we worked with where they used economic input or spend data on materials like steel. And then the steel might say, using an economic output model, that per kilogram of steel they purchase, there's a certain emission factor for greenhouse gases. However, that number is usually very, it's usually not very accurate, but it gives you an idea to give a feel for what products and materials are driving those impacts in terms of scope 3. And then you can use that to get better data. So if you go to directly to your supplier and they say, oh, we have our scope 1 and 2 data and we can give you that, you can actually then get a much more accurate number. So an example would be for steel, the economic output data would basically say, oh, for every kilogram of steel, it's like 7 kilograms of CO2 equivalent in emissions based on input output. But when you actually get data direct from your suppliers, their scope 1 and 2 is maybe around 1.6, 1.5. And then if you add in their scope 3, maybe it's around 2 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So you can see there's a big reduction that would occur there in those estimates that you do as you're trying to put that information together. So this is why the greenhouse gas protocols are requiring companies to continually improve their data. It's also really important for you all on this call when you're reporting out for these regulations to have a really good feeling that your scope 3 data that you're putting together has some robustness to it, and it's not purely on estimates. And that's why you see with some of these regulations that are coming out, they're giving companies time to basically collect the data, start to get it together. For example, that California regulation that requires reporting in 2026 of scope 1 and 2, that's going to allow the companies that put their scope 1 and 2 data together, number one, to get it together, but number two, to get third-party verification or assurance that they followed the greenhouse gas protocols properly. And then scope 3 is another one where getting that primary data eventually is going to be a key. But I can tell you right now, the likelihood of getting primary data from every supplier is very low right now. So you have to use a combination of these estimates and then keep improving as we go back to this, starting out down here and moving up until you will eventually get supplier specific data. So if we look at why we want to improve this is, again, very inaccurate, not the most accurate when you're using spend-based, and then using more specific data like direct data from your suppliers, direct data from other service providers, et cetera, being able to get LCAs, reports or LCA databases and environmental product declarations, because those will give you actually a greenhouse gas emission factor per some functional unit of a product. So like that steel example I used, if there was an EPD or an LCA available for that, you could actually get more information about that would be more accurate than using a spend-based approach. So here's an example of, this is a very sanitized example of a analysis that we did. If you remember, if I go back to the chemical sector, we knew purchased goods and services was a big deal in terms of the highest impact in scope 3 emissions. So when we did that analysis, we found that there were multiple chemicals or suppliers or ingredients that this particular company was buying, and they knew that chemical A made up 45% of that emission factor. And again, these are based on estimates, so it's not perfect, but it gives you a good idea. They also know chemical B, chemical C, chemical D are pretty big. So where would you focus? You'd want to be zooming in on this to say, all right, we know chemical A and B are probably where we're going to prioritize and dive in deep to try to get more information. So this is where that supplier engagement comes together. This is where working directly with your procurement team, trying to get more specific data for all this is going to be really important as you move forward here. So this is just an example of how you would approach this. So after you do your initial identify what are your top 3 or 4 categories, then you start to dive in deeper. And because this is such a big process, by narrowing it down and looking at top suppliers or top materials that you use, that's a really good way to move forward with that. So this is going to be very interesting in terms of evolution over time, in terms of getting that specific information. So again, primary data is the holy grail. So One thing I want to point out here is, you know, if we're thinking about purchase goods and services, how would I even start a supplier reach out plan? Well, identify and start working with those key suppliers. These suppliers are definitely getting hammered left and right. You know, we have multiple companies we're working with that got those letters from the pharmaceutical industry. They're also getting other requests through EcoVadis and, you know, different things like that. And then in order to get them to communicate that data and basically do everything the right way, I would strongly consider offering a training to these key suppliers, especially the ones that, you know, maybe don't have much going on in terms of their maturity level and things like that. And that's one of the reasons we created our Scope 3 Training Academy, and we'll talk a little more about that a little later. So, you know, these are just some action plans in terms of getting that whole movement going with your suppliers, establishing a recurring pulse, identifying the right personnel to reach out to. This really needs to be collaborative. You know, if you're going to kind of dictate this down, it makes it really complicated for the suppliers. They're already nervous because many of them don't know how to do this. And then basically continue over time to, you know, get more suppliers engaged and involved. And the more that this happens, and they're, you know, the more that it's going to drive movement. So we know these suppliers are important. So let's have one more poll here. So if you are actively, the question is, are you actively engaging with your suppliers, yes or no? So let's get a feel for here, how many companies are doing this. Okay, we definitely have a group. And then I have a subpart to this as well. If you are answering yes to this, we also want to know, and we're going to launch in the second poll here. So we're getting good votes going here. About 65% of you are saying yes, we're working with our suppliers, 36% no. So definitely good that you're on this, you know, giving you some good guidance here. Even for the ones that are on this and engaging with your suppliers, most of you are probably just starting a supplier engagement strategy and just starting initial reach out. All right, that's great. We can close this with about 64% are saying yes and 36% said no. So if we go back to this poll, I want to have one more question here. Who is overseeing and directing your Scope 3 engagement with your suppliers? Is it the sustainability team, the procurement team, specialized Scope 3 team, or is your company not engaging with suppliers at all? So let's see what we get here. So it looks like a lot. Oh, it's a race here. Sustainability team and procurement team. We got procurement team coming in strong here. We got a bunch saying you're not engaging. So this is excellent information. This helps me to speak to this. All right, we got about, we'll try to get to 60-some% voted so we can keep moving here. All right, so it looks like it's pretty much, you know, we got about almost 60% voted here. About 58% your procurement teams are engaging, and then 48% is sustainability team. So, or maybe it's some combination of both, with about 18% basically having not engaging at all, but 5% with a specialized Scope 3 team. So we are definitely seeing that as well. We have seen multiple companies that are out there working either as a specialized team or they're diving in deep, you know, with their procurement teams. So coming back to this you know, Scope 3 categories that are really critical, you know, we've talked a lot about purchase goods and services, but capital goods is also another one. If you're a company that is, you know, expanding your operations, you're buying new equipment, you're building out a new factory, that capital goods is going to be a big one for you. And anybody that's manufacturing something is most likely going to have upstream transportation and distribution. That's the raw materials and things that you're receiving from your suppliers. It's definitely something that has an effect, and I'm going to show this in a minute. And then your downstream transportation distribution, that's how you're getting your products out to the market. And that's usually done, many companies do this with a third party, where they're going to hire a transportation company to deliver those things out to the world. So again, every company is going to be different on what's important to them, but this is something that we need to look at. So this is where I want to say that working in collaboration with these suppliers is really critical. This is a long journey, and this level of collaboration that you do is really based on the supplier's maturity and their sustainability journey. So the goal, though, is as you get these suppliers engaged, is you definitely want to see a collaborative performance improvement activity going on with the goal of eventually getting primary data from them, at least in Scope 1 and 2, and then eventually scope 3, and possibly getting them to start doing their own life cycle assessment or product carbon footprints in the future, and then that commitment to reducing emissions. So when I showed you that example there with AstraZeneca, where they're saying that they're looking at a 95% reduction in their scope 3 emissions, that is not something they have control over. They're going to have to really count on their suppliers getting on board, setting those science-based targets, and that's part of their initiative. By getting them to set science-based targets, that these suppliers are going to start to focus on that. And then what I would say here is you definitely want to get that communication process going, and then we're finding that training and education of suppliers is really critical based on their maturity level. So, you might want to start out first getting them understanding, measuring, and reporting their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Then once they have done that, they could start to focus on their operations and reducing their carbon footprint in their operations. Or then they can start measuring their scope 3 emissions and reducing their own product carbon footprint. So this is an example. This comes right from our Scope 3 Training Academy, and this is how we look at maturity. So have your suppliers measured their scope 1 and 2 emissions? No. Then they would start with our module 1, which is how to basically understand, measure, and report your scope 1 and 2 emissions. If your suppliers have already done that, then maybe they start in module 2, which is how they would basically take that information on their scope 1 and 2 emissions and start to reduce those scope 1 and 2 emissions in their operations through energy efficiency and renewable electricity. And if they've already done that, then maybe the next step for them is getting them to help set their own science-based targets or reduction goals, understanding their own scope 3, and diving in deep on, starting to optimize their products. So many of you that are on this were on our LCA webinar series, and we were basically talking about LCA, looking at life cycle impacts from, cradle to grave, or just even from cradle to gate, which is where raw materials, transportation, and manufacturing come in. And when we look at this optimization, this is a slide that I used in the webinar series. When we run a life cycle assessment, we know that this blue bar here is mostly coming from our suppliers of the raw materials and ingredients we're using in making our product. The red bar here is coming from that transportation step of getting those materials and products to our plant so we can manufacture them. And then this green bar is what is in control of me, the company, in my manufacturing operations, where if I'm reducing my scope 1 and 2, I can start to reduce my carbon footprint of my products. So if we wanted to zoom in on this and we dive deeper, we would know that if I started to look at these raw materials that I'm using and the ingredients going into my product, I would be looking at, in this case, material 7 is the biggest driver, and I would start saying, I'm really going to reach out to my suppliers in this. So many of you that have done LCA, this is a great tool as well to help you start to know where to start in terms of understanding your movement forward. So now let's talk for a few minutes here, and then we'll get into questions. What are my options? I'm reporting scope 3. How am I going to do this continuous data improvement? I can tell you right now, our company continues to use spreadsheets. And many of you are using spreadsheets, and there's pros and cons to both. Spreadsheets can get really unwieldy and complicated when you're starting to really, for scope 1 and 2, maybe they're not too bad, but when you start diving in deeply on your scope 3, they get really challenging. So there's a lot of activity out there with various companies putting out softwares, and there's pros and cons to these softwares. The pros are that once you get the software built up, it definitely will save a lot of time. A lot of the softwares can talk directly to your ERP system, like SAP or Oracle. They can also talk to your utility database. You can get your suppliers reporting directly into them. And these are really helpful in terms of this. And this gives you the ability then to do that ongoing data tracking and measurement and save a lot of time. One example is a company that we're working with. We partnered with Sustainlife. We evaluated all the different software platforms. And don't get me wrong, we're still using spreadsheets on many things, but we are a lot more of our activity and most of our work is using the Sustainlife platform right now that allows us to measure, to manage, and to report. And it also allows us then to start to drive that continuous improvement and track that continuous improvement in the software itself, which then gives us the ability for direct reporting into CDP or EcoVadis. And basically giving us that opportunity to keep things moving forward here. So many of you might have been required to report to CDP, or you're reporting to CDP, or you're requiring your suppliers to do this. So the ability for these softwares to be able to talk back and forth to these platforms is really important, because that's one way you can start to get some primary data as you go forward here. So again, continuous ongoing reporting, really important. Now let's dive in a little bit. I want to make sure we get some questions here. I want to go into our resources. I did want to let you all know that we do have our Conquering Carbon Scope 3 Training Academy. That's the basis for what we do here. We do know that many of you are struggling with this, and we have multiple activities going on with training in different departments and supporting this. We've been in business doing this for since 2001, and our team is, diving in deep and doing these Scope 3 analysis and working really closely with suppliers as we go forward. And our training academy consists of a Scope 3 training academy for sourcing and procurement teams, and that would be mainly for the teams that are involved in this. It's a 3-hour training that we do to get the procurement teams up to speed and to help them execute these requirements a lot faster as they're trying to do this Scope 3 work and work directly with suppliers. And then our Scope 3 Training Academy for suppliers is actually 3 webinar-based training modules that includes 4 sessions in each module. That takes about a year. The supplier would go through this whole thing. There's an amazing workbook that guides this, and the suppliers are really getting a lot out of it. So really great information here. There's a lot more information on our website about this. I did want to let you all know we are doing another webinar next week with Sustain Life to talk about more how to tackle Scope 3 emissions in purchased goods and services. You can register here if you're interested on this QR code. And then one thing that we're going to be sending out to all of you to follow up on this is, and this is very optional, Juliana will be sending this out. There is what we call a readiness assessment. This will be a questionnaire. If you put your name and email in here and run through this, we can basically give you an action plan afterwards on where you might need to start, what would be your action plan depending on what level of maturity or level you're at in terms of your movement there. And then in terms of our resources, we have this great resources page here that we put together, and you can definitely access all the information you need on this. Juliana will be sending out information. She's going to be sending a follow-up. You're all going to get the recording of this, as well as links to these things, as well as the readiness survey and whatnot. So if you see an email come in from Juliana, you know that she's definitely someone who's been involved in this. And then last but not least, we are going to have a survey today that will pop up. And if you can fill that out, again, it's totally optional, but it really helps us to tailor the way we do these webinars. So we've gotten a lot of feedback in the past, and these are really helpful. So with that, my contact information is right here if you want more information, but let's try to dive into a question or two. It looks like we've got about 6 or 7 minutes. So I'm going to scroll up here in the question pane. It looks like we got a good number of questions. So it says here, spend-based analysis is a good first step, but my opinion is that calculation needs to be volume-based, especially in a world of consumer goods and chemicals. What is your opinion? I will say that is a very good, I would agree 100% there, that, like I said, spend-based is critical for getting started in terms of identifying those hot spots and what categories are most critical to you, but that is not the end all. The volume-based really gives you the ability to say, all right, a volume-based would mean, as a company, let's say I'm manufacturing doors or something. I know how much steel I bought, or I know if I've got some plastic in those doors. I know how much plastic I bought from my suppliers. So that would give me the volume. Let's say it's 100 tons of steel, or 10,000 kilograms of steel, and 1 million kilograms of plastic, or whatever. That volume data would be really helpful. Then that I could actually, if I get an emission factor associated with, say, the steel itself, or let's say it's a certain type of plastic, then I would get a much more accurate number. So we do, again, we always start out with spend base just to get started. But our company, when we're doing our hotspots and our baselining, we are not just exclusively doing spend-based. If we can get that volume data and we can get that information from your procurement team, we're going to do a combination of things as we're doing those calculations. Ultimately, we want to do, the average data method, and then evolve eventually to doing, getting that primary data directly from suppliers. But I would agree with that question right there, that we would want to do volume-based as much as possible. So that's a great observation. All right, we have another question here. Procurement has often no resources for extra activities, which is the one thing that can help to motivate them. Oh no, what is the one thing that can help motivate them to move forward in terms of collaborating on this? Well, this is a big issue, and that's one reason we actually did put together the Scope 3 Training Academy for sourcing and procurement teams, because we have found that many of them are really trying to do their regular job, and this happens all the time. And what we have found is by training them and getting them understanding and realizing this might not be as complicated for them, because it could be interwoven into their current job, because they're routinely reaching out to suppliers, engaging suppliers, different things like that. That is one method that we have found, by that training and education of them, gives them the confidence and the understanding of how this could be done without adding maybe a ton of extra burden on top of them. So that's a really important aspect that we would typically look for as we're promoting that. So, and again, that definitely guides these suppliers, these procurement teams, in giving them that information. I have another question here that says, we are struggling to get suppliers to respond to our surveys. Do you have any tips on what to do there? Well, many of the suppliers are definitely surveyed out. So what we have been finding, that if you can get a collaborative method going in terms of getting those suppliers engaged without just sending a survey, number one, the surveys scare them, but if you can actually get some engagement where you can, either offer the trainings for them, or you can put together some type of a webinar to give them guidance on what they're looking for, that would be really helpful. The other thing that you could do is give them, many companies are actually having what they have, they invite their suppliers to, like a supplier collaboration day, where they're basically bringing the suppliers in, and they might invite their top 100, 200 suppliers. And, there's a lot of things that get, covered in that. It's not just sustainability, but then they weave that into that supplier conference on what's going on in terms of Scope 3, start to educate them and what you're going to be asking for. That's one way to get more engagement from those suppliers. So that is definitely a very helpful thing to do. I did get another question here about, will this presentation be shared? Yes, we're definitely sharing it. Like I said, Juliana will be sending that out. And another thing that somebody asked here is, will we be doing any additional webinars? Well, we are doing that webinar with on the Sustain Life team next week to talk about how to use software platforms to dive deep on purchase goods and services. And we are going to be probably offering additional Scope 3 Training Academy webinars in the future here as well. So definitely would be looking forward to getting you involved there. All right. One more question I just got is, what categories are we routinely seeing, for many different companies, and how does this affect service providers? Well, it's interesting that many companies, when they look at their purchase goods and services, they might find that based on spend and based on impact from the dollars and cents perspective, that maybe their advertising agency or some of their consultants are actually driving a lot of that impact. So when that comes down to that, obviously there's a whole different thing to look at there, because when you're talking to a service provider, you're going to be looking at the service provider's buildings and operations. They're going to be, basically looking at their commuting and their travel and different things like that. So you definitely have to educate a service provider a little differently than someone that manufactures something. But we have done that, and we've gotten some great engagement. In fact, we get questions all the time from service providers that get those emails, like I showed you, that came from the pharmaceutical company. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. It's looks like we're right at time. I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today, and really appreciate your interaction and activity here. And definitely, like I said, look for an email from Juliana. She'll be sending this information out to you, and please complete the surveys to help us do more in the future.